At this point, I'd like to introduce a man I just met today, the Ernie DeMaio, who is with the United Electrical Workers. I've heard a hell of a lot about him. I suppose we all have. But I know I've worked with Frank Rosen from his union. I know that they have fought long and hard, and he's got the difficult problem, his union, handling a lot of these smaller companies, and that automatically creates problems. So without any further discussion, I'd like to, at this point, introduce Ernie DeMaio from the United Electrical Workers.
Brother Chairman, brothers and sisters, the occupational hazard of speaking is pretty high. 3 of our speakers couldn't make it today. I guess the only reason why we're here, George, is we didn't have sense enough to get sick. Some years back, in the reign of the great liberator, and for those of you who don't know who the great liberator was, Herbert Hoover was President of the United States then. And he distinguished himself by liberating the working class from their jobs. We had some 17 million people unemployed in those days. For his contributions to the welfare of the American people, the John Birch Society recently canonized him. I go into this because it was around that time that I began to concern myself with some of the problems of working people. And I find out that the lot of the working people is not that which many writers like to have us believe. It's rather popular today to say that the American worker is middle class in income and middle class in outlook. It's usually middle class writers that write this junk. The truth of the matter is the average worker in the United States today in industry is making about $4,000 a year less than the Department of Labor says is necessary for a moderate income for a family of 4. As for his outlook, well, with the brilliant leadership of men such as George Meany, it's quite possible that he may be a bit confused about the objectives and perspectives of the American labor movement. Dealing with OSHA, it's my experience on safety before and since OSHA was enacted that companies will only go as far as they are required to go or as the law requires them to go, and they won't even do that if there isn't a union on the job putting the heat on them to do it. And the reason for that is a very simple one. American corporations are in business for only one reason. And I think that Cal Coolidge put it very succinctly. He said the purpose of American business is business. In other words, they're in business to make a buck. And making a buck comes a little easier if they don't have to pay money for the safety of the workers. They just do without them. I had an experience once in General Motors in Dayton, Ohio years ago. I was walking through one of the plants there which we had recently organized, a large plant, Delco Products. And as I walked through the plant, I noticed that there was safety tape over the buttons of a huge press. It required 2 men on one side to put in a sheet metal and 2 men to take it on the other side, and all 4 men had to hit 2 buttons. There were a total of 8 buttons in all. That was to keep their hands away from the press. So I went from machine to machine, and I saw any number of these machines taped down, and they stood out because all of the machines were painted a sort of an avocado color, and you know how the tape will stand out against that. And when we got through with the tour of the plant, I said to the plant manager, why do the men tape down those buttons? He said, well, it's the men that want to do it. We have strict rules of safety here. We don't permit that. And I said, come on, get off it. I take one tour of the plant and I see dozens of machines with the buttons taped down, and your foreman can't see it. They're in that plant all day long. Well, we put up a fight on that, and that went on until one day, two of the men on the other side who didn't hear the guys on this side yell, let it go, because this was an incentive shop in those days. They were out to make every penny they could. To make a long story short, they lost their hands. Everybody in the plant then became safety conscious. I had a recent experience here in Chicago dealing with two of our men being disciplined and sent home. And the reason why they were sent home for 3 days was that they left their place of employment without getting the okay of supervision. It seemed that what happened is one of the workers there got badly injured, and they did have a first aid kit, but it was locked up. And the only one that had the key to that kit was the foreman. And they couldn't find the foreman. And here was this worker, unconscious, bleeding, and the workers decided that the only thing to do was to get him out of the plant, get him to a hospital, and have him taken care of. Well, as I said, we found out about that as a result of the disciplinary actions, and we just had to go in and raise holy hell. We, of course, got the men their pay for the 3 days they're lost, but as far as the worker was concerned, he could have died had he followed the company's policies. Now, why is this so? I think you'll have to recognize the fact that profits are made not from machines, but from people. If profits came from machinery, why, the bosses wouldn't hire anybody. They'd just sit in the office and wait for the profits to roll in. The exploitative factor is labor. We better recognize that. In every plant any one of you has ever been in, they'll have large maintenance departments to take care of machinery. See to it that it's running up to snuff, and that's important to the company, because if the machines aren't operating right, the men can't produce as much as the company wants to have produced. And machinery is expensive. But you won't find first aid rooms, you won't find a doctor on the premise, you rarely will find a registered nurse on the premises. If you find someone there, it's some woman who is called a paramedic. She knows how to put iodine on a scratch or a cut and how to bandage something up, and that's about it. Or they have groups of men that they train as a safety committee who can administer first aid. Now, that's about the extent of the type of safety measures there are in most of the plants in American industry. And why is this? Well, workers come cheap. As a matter of fact, they come for nothing. Outside the gates, every day, there are people walking into that plant looking for jobs. There is no pressure, therefore, on the company to concern itself with the health and the welfare of its employees. And they don't. The only difference, the only reason why a company is kept on its toes is if there's a union in there that's militantly concerned with the interests and the welfare of the workers they represent. Wednesday of this week, I was at one of our plants. We have a clause, they deal with powdered lead oxide. And this is a very fine powder, and when there's dust around that department, and as a result of this, some 20, 25 years ago, we wrote a clause in the contract that these workers would have to be examined, their urine and a blood stipple test every 3 months. I had occasion to be there Wednesday, and I thought I would check into that particular clause because I had something to do with it way back then. And to my surprise, I found out that there hadn't been a test in that plant for years. And I called the caucus and asked the committee why this was so. They said, well, the company just doesn't want to do it. And I said, well, what the hell are you guys doing about it? They said, well, we talk about it. And I said, that's not enough. We got the company back in the session, and we got an agreement in writing that within the next 10 days, everyone in that plant would go through a test. Those in the powder room would get a test every 3 months. And of course, if they show any signs of toxicity, then they are to be removed from the environs of that particular department. Now, that isn't much. The point I am making is you can write things into the contract, or you can have a law. But if you don't have a union that's on its toes and enforcing the contract and see to it that the law is enforced. You're not going to get any safety. You're not going to get any health measures as far as the company is concerned. Now, I had some written remarks here. I haven't touched on them because, wait, how much time do I have? Okay. Dealing with the question of exploitation, not all the health and safety problems are in the plant. The health and safety of workers is every bit a part of the living standards. If workers don't make enough money to be able to buy decent food, they don't eat well, and therefore their health is endangered. And I think when we're in a situation where we have runaway inflation, the living standards of the American people are being hammered down, and the health of the working people is endangered. We are told that the reason for the high prices, the runaway high prices now taking place, is that there are shortages. Well, there are always shortages, because American industry uses computers today for only one purpose: to see to it that they never produce quite enough to meet the needs of the market. Artificial scarcities are created so as to keep the products scarce and the prices high. You've probably heard that recently we devalued the dollar. And the theory behind this is that to the extent that we devalue the dollar, American products will be cheaper abroad, and foreign products will be more costly here. That would not only improve our trade balance, but would create additional jobs in the United States. Well, since we're in our third inflation, and this hasn't happened, let's take a look at it. The first the first devaluation of the dollar came on August 15, when Nixon gave us phase one. At the same time, he slammed the dollar window, which meant that some of the, at that time, $65, $70 billion and $80 billion today in paper money is floating around Europe and Japan. The devaluation then was 8%. We didn't improve our trade picture at all. As a matter of fact, we had our first deficit in our balance of trade in 1971, the first one since 1888. And that was a rather small deficit, $2.5 billion. Last year, one full year of phase 1 and 2, with controls on wages, and presumably time enough for the first devaluation to have its effect, the deficit grew to $6.4 billion in trade. Now, why don't these deficits provide trade, and why do they cause high prices in the United States? If the dollar is cheaper abroad, in order to maintain the same earnings, we have to sell more goods. And since we are not selling more goods, the deficit is greater. Two, the raw materials that we buy abroad, and we're a deficit nation in many major raw materials: oil, iron ore, bauxite for aluminum, copper, tungsten, so on down the line. They cost more because our cheaper dollars, it requires more of them to buy these foreign ores. The products made from these ores here in the United States become more expensive. Three, as American industry is protected by the higher prices for foreign-made goods, they engage in a little bit of what business is all about. They hike the prices of the American goods, which are no longer threatened by foreign competition. Anyone who's familiar with the auto industry will know that. In August of 1971, we were told the automobile industry was in trouble. Not really, because Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors control the automobile industry of the world. They either own it or are the largest stockholders of all the major automobile plants in Japan. General Motors is the largest producer of automobiles in Germany, and Ford is the largest producer in England. Chrysler is the largest in France, so on down the line. What did they do? Well, one, originally there was a 10% surcharge on foreign goods, and the excise tax was taken off, as you recall, so one sort of offset the other. And if you know anything about prices, you will note that the prices of our cheaper automobiles today continue to be just a little bit above the price of the foreign-made products. But what is even more important in its effect on inflation and the lives of our people and ultimately their health is that we are the largest exporter of food products in the world. That isn't generally known. Now, if products that we make here as a result of 3 devaluations are cheaper abroad, this makes our foodstuffs a bargain in many other countries. The result is a large surge in exports in foods last year, approximately $11 billion worth, and it's anticipated somewhere between $12 and $13 billion worth of foodstuffs will be exported this year. The Japanese happen to be doing very well right now, and they've developed a taste for beef, American beef. And it's a fine market, and there's a little more profit to be made on beef there than can be made at the present time here in the United States. So on down the line. So the American people find themselves being exploited at every twist and turn of their lives, at the point of production and in their daily lives, as it affects their living standards. I don't think that we're going to be able to just deal with these problems just by the type of legislation we're likely to get as a result of some pressures being put on Congress. OSHA, with all of its weaknesses, with all of its flaws, we were successful in getting that because at the time it was being considered in Congress and everybody knew it was headed for defeat, and if it were by any chance to have passed Congress, it was going to face a presidential veto. We struck it rich. A big mine disaster. Some 83 miners are killed in a mine disaster, and there's a great furor throughout the country, and nobody in Congress had the guts at that time to vote against that law, and the law was passed. Having been passed and being put on the books, we find our maximum leader, Mr. Nixon, deciding that this legislation is because, you know, he wants more power in the hands of the people. You've heard that expression. He means more power in the hands of his kind of people, not more power in the hands of the people of the United States. He wants this to revert back to the states. And the only purpose of reverting health and safety back to the states is there will be less of it. Industry fought this measure tooth and toenail. They continue to fight it. They're carrying on seminars on how to gut it and how to convince employers in the various states that the whole purpose of the law is, don't forget it, it's only on the books, it will not be enforced. We're going to get this kind of treatment in every aspect of our lives as long as we remain unorganized in a political sense. The American working people have no political power. I don't regard a guy who blasts Nixon one day and then golfs with him the next day as representing power for the American workers. You can put every man in Congress that ever was rich. All else is hogwash. Until we make that turn towards independent political action, OSHA, all the other legislation is meaningless. Let me give you an example of what I mean by absolutely useless legislation. A few years ago, we had a strike in Indiana. This company was importing scabs from Ohio and Michigan. And we thought we'd put a stop to that because we knew there was a law on the books known as the Burns Act. And the Burns Act said that any employer importing scabs from another state with the intent of strike breaking. This was illegal, and the punishment would be a 5-year rap in a federal pen and a $10,000 fine. So we went down and saw a lawyer about it. We had the goods. We took the automobile license plates of these people. We had their names. We ran down some of them as to where they lived. And then the lawyer told us what it was all about. He said, there's one word in there that you missed, and that's intent. And nobody has ever been able to prove the intent of an employer bringing in scabs. Good Lord, they don't do that. They have no such intent. Why, American corporations love labor. Occasionally you'll see them at banquets sitting side by side and breaking bread to prove it. Needless to say, we got nowhere on that one, and we had to rely on our own resources to win that strike. One more point, and I'll leave this question. The Census Bureau recently issued a report which showed that American corporations have closed down plants or departments employing 1,300,000 people. They open new plants in the Orient, in exotic places like Taiwan and South Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Hong Kong, and Indonesia. Remember that last one, Indonesia. On January 22nd of this year, Business Week reported on the bonanza Indonesia represents for American corporations. The wages there are 10 cents an hour, said the Business Week, with high labor productivity. All of these countries are brutal dictatorships, client states of America, maintained by American military power. American corporations are closing plants in the United States, paying $3 and $4 an hour, taking our latest technology paid for by our tax money for research and development, with that latest technology putting plants in these areas where these dictatorships prevail and where unions are not permitted to exist. A labor movement worth its salt would raise holy hell about our government providing subsidies to corporations to engage in this kind of endeavor. The least that we ought to be able to be doing in the absence of a political organization of our own is to raise holy hell about our permitting corporations to do this in countries where unions are not permitted to exist. And if we're going to talk about the health and safety of people, what the hell do you think the health and safety of people is that are earning 10 cents an hour? And as long as they can get that kind of production done for that kind of money, then the health and safety of American workers in American plants is endangered. Because American industry seeks to make a buck. In pursuit of the maximization of profits, they will always seek the lowest possible wages, the lowest possible cost of production, constantly lowering the unit cost per production, engaging in one measure after another. Speed up. The General Electric Company has a little chart. I thought I brought it with me today, but it's the size of a playing card. It has on it broken down into hundredths of a second. Well, 1/100th of a minute, and then in hundredths of a minute, how many hundredths it takes to move your arm this far, to grab something, to lift a foot, put it on a foot pedal. Each move is figured out, what they say scientifically. They put their stopwatchmen to work, and the whole concept is that for every moment other than your rest period and your lunch period, you will be producing for that company. Every bit of motion has to be accounted for. No waste motion. When people work under these conditions, and people are not machines and they're expected to maintain the pace of machines, they break down. They break down mentally, they break down physically. And it isn't something that you can easily prove. The machine is not out of whack. We have plants where they're air conditioned, constant temperature 1 year, all year round, and yet they work under this kind of conditions where they're being broken down physically and mentally. That requires something more than a law. It requires something more than just one union in one plant dealing with a giant multinational corporation. It requires a labor movement aware of its responsibilities to the people. And until we develop that, we'll continue to fight on the lines wherever that fight takes us, but blending our fight, merging it with the struggles of other people in other areas where they're being exploited in their living conditions, at home, in transportation, and on the job. And when we merge all of these movements, when the labor movement becomes more responsive to the needs, the interests, and the welfare of the membership it represents, we will have a political force in America that will not only bring health and safety, but will bring political power to the American people.